Welcome to the Culture Report, Voice of Russia, America's weekly look into the world of arts, culture, and history. I'm Rob Sachs. In his new book, The Black Russian, Yale historian Vladimir Alexandrov chronicles the story of Frederick Bruce Thomas from the fields of Mississippi to the streets of Moscow. Voice of Russia New York correspondent Vasili Sushko met up with Alexandrov and brings us this interview.
Was it immediately obvious to you that his life merits a biography? What attracted you most, the amazing personality of Frederick Thomas, or was it the colorful historical backdrop of found-a-sick Europe and Russia?
It was the complete unlikeliness that somebody who was black would be in Moscow before the First World War and apparently very successful. Russia simply had virtually no black people of any kind living there permanently in those days, the days when American black writers and actors like Paul Robeson most famously went to the Soviet Union were still decades in the future. So it was the surprising nature of this fact that interested me. And I've always been drawn to the period just before the revolution. It was a very rich period in Russian history and culture, so that added to the interest.
Let's talk about the major episodes of Frederick Thomas's life. Frederick Thomas's origins were inauspicious. However, his parents were remarkably entrepreneurial and hardy people, something you write Thomas must have learned from. Tell us a few words about Frederick's parents.
It's definitely the case that Thomas got his wings from his parents because they had been slaves until the end of the Civil War in Mississippi. The flight of freedmen immediately after the Civil War was a difficult one, but Thomas's parents managed in 1869, 4 years after the Civil War ended, to buy at auction a 200-acre farm in Mississippi, which immediately put them into a very small minority of black landowners. That was one remarkable achievement on their part. Another thing that they did that showed a real commitment toward their community was that a decade later, they donated an acre of land to found an African Methodist Episcopal Church, which was the black church of the region. Things continued in the same way. They increased the size of their farm from 200 acres to over 600 acres over the years. They started out branch businesses, in some cases collaborating with white people who lived in the area. And then when, in 1886, a rich white farmer, fundamentally for racist reasons, tried to seize their land, they fought back in court, and they actually managed to win the first phase of the legal process. So this kind of commitment to one's own interests, this kind of originality that they showed is something that Thomas obviously learned from them as well, and it carried him through his life, including his remarkable adventures in Russia and later in Turkey.
At the age of 18, Frederick leaves the southern U.S. for Chicago and New York. Was he motivated by the desire to escape the racism in the South, or was he driven more by intense wanderlust and the desire to make something of himself?
I think both. He experienced a different form of life than he knew in rural Mississippi when he wound up in Memphis, Tennessee in 1890. He went to school there, a school that was founded by liberally minded white people from the North. So I think that he saw that there were other kinds of people in the United States than the ones he was exposed to in the white-dominated South where he originated from. But he also said in a memoir that I found that he wanted to see something of the world. And he did something very unusual for a young black man in those days. He went north. In the end of the 19th century, that's not what young black men usually did. The Great Migration, which happened at the end of the First World War during the 20s and 30s, was still decades ahead. So Frederick Thomas went to Chicago, which had a minuscule black population in those days, between 1% and 2%. He worked there for a while. Then he went to New York City, which also had a tiny black population in those days. So he began very quickly to break the mold and to try new things in a desire to, I think, find greater freedom for himself and also to spread his wings in sort of new locales.
In his early 20s, Frederick Thomas leaves for Europe, first London, then Paris, and then a score of other places. You write that he often worked as a waiter for short periods of time before moving on to another city or country. What was it about Frederick Thomas that helped him to find employment so easily?
Being a waiter is a wonderfully portable profession. Once you learn how to be a good waiter, and the demands on waiters at the best restaurants in Chicago and New York, where Thomas worked in the 1890s, were very high, then you had learned the ropes that you could then exploit anywhere. And so the evidence that I found shows that he was able to find employment pretty much anytime he wanted at upscale places in various major European cities and resort areas. And this allowed him to travel widely. If you look at a map of Europe over the years that he traveled through Europe from about 1894 through 1899 to 1900, he zigzagged from north to south to east and west, being everywhere that was interesting and important.
Frederick Thomas comes to Russia in 1899, and that's where he decides to settle. Do we know as to his reasons for choosing Russia of all places in Europe?
It seems that he was employed by a charismatic nobleman, and there are possibilities that it might have even been a member of the Russian imperial family, a Grand Duke, because there's evidence that Thomas worked in Monte Carlo in the late 1890s, which was one of the favorite spots for Russian Grand Dukes to burn through the empire's money as they had a good time. And so he was taken to Russia as the personal servant of a nobleman. And after that, it seems probably the case that he liked Moscow in particular because of how mixed it was in terms of ethnicities. There were people from all over the Russian Empire. Not everyone's eyes were round, not everyone's skin was white. And so although statistically there were very few people of any kind of African origin in Russia in those days, he didn't stand out as much as one might expect because of the variety of ethnic types that you could see, especially on Moscow city streets.
Vladimir, you write in the book, quote, "For Frederick and the Muscovites, money and personal flair trumped ethnicity or race, with the glaring exception of Jews. It's remarkable that a black man of humble origin yet formidable talents and drive could make such a success of himself in Russia, a success that would have been next to impossible for him in the United States at the time. Yet millions of Jews were leaving Russia for America and Europe because of widespread anti-Semitism in the Russian Empire. In fact, the Pale of Settlement was not that dissimilar to the Jim Crow laws, just like pogroms were to mass lynchings of the American South. In your opinion, was Frederick Thomas aware of this dark irony?
There are certainly parallels of the sort that you mentioned between the status of blacks in Jim Crow America and the status of Jews in the Russian Empire. I'm assuming, I don't have any direct evidence for it, but I'm assuming that Thomas sensed this. And the reason for this is that he actually fostered, during the First World War, the staging of a play that originated in the United States that was sympathetic to Jews. And I think for a black man with his past to go so against the grain of the norms in Russia at the time, the norms being generally an anti-Semitic attitude, and to help the staging of a play that showed Jewish people in a positive light, indicates some degree of awareness on his part of the fact that there were these ironic similarities between blacks in the United States and Jews in Russia.
Frederick Thomas's rise to success, fame, and prosperity was rather swift in Russia, first as a maitre d' in the finest Moscow restaurants, and then as a co-owner of the most famous variety theaters of the time, such as the Aquarium Gardens and Maxim. In your biography, he comes across as a very dignified, charming, and courteous man. However, running a massive entertainment business in early 20th century Moscow was no walk in the park. He must have been incredibly tough and even cunning, no?
Absolutely. He was a real wheeler-dealer when he had to be. And I found wonderful evidence for this in a French archive, which is correspondence between a Russian lawyer who had been hired by a French copyright agency to get Russian entertainment tycoons like Frederick Thomas in Moscow to pay royalties on the French music that they performed. And the numerous letters that I found in which the Russian lawyer reports back to his bosses about how it's going with Thomas show that Thomas played him. He played him like a skillful fisherman plays a fish on a hook, by promising to pay him at some point, then finding an excuse not to. He kept the French lawyer running around for 3.5 to 4 years without paying him a kopeck. And this was obviously a tactic that Thomas used on other occasions as well. Moreover, when the First World War began, prohibition was proclaimed in Russia, much as it would be in the United States a few years later. That's when Thomas made the most money of all, because he obviously participated in bootlegging enterprises and sold all kinds of liquor, as everybody else was doing who was savvy about these things. So yes, he certainly was a cunning man, in addition to being a dignified and a kind man.
What would one expect to enjoy in establishments run by Frederick Thomas? You quote a contemporary describing the aquarium as, quote, a perfectly respectable operetta theater, an equally respectable open-air music hall, a definitely less respectable café chantant, and the inevitable chain of private cabinets for gypsy singing and private carouses.
Yeah, that's the full range. In other words, a place like the Aquarium Garden, which was several acres of park-like land near the center of Moscow, a remnant of the place still exists today, would have various venues that people could attend. They could go to a theater and see an operetta or a light comedy, which would be perfectly fine for husbands to take their wives to. They could go to another stage and see a vaudeville show with everything from operatic singers warbling away to trained animal acts to trick bicycle riders to comedians. That would also be something that you could bring your spouse to. However, there were also more risque acts that would appear at a later time on that stage. There would be chorus girls who would do song and dance numbers. Much of the attraction that these chorus girls had for their clients was that they were pretty and flirtatious. And it was in keeping with the norms of the time that a client who had booked for himself and for his friends a private room from which they could see the stage could send a note to a performer who particularly appealed to them, and she would be expected to go join them in their private room for a continuation of the party. Now, what that exactly entailed, of course, varied, but it obviously involved an atmosphere of sexual license up to a point. Although Thomas himself knew this world and lived in it, it's interesting that he did not exploit performers in the same way that some other owners of entertainment venues did. In fact, I found a memoir of a Russian young woman who performed in a place where Thomas worked, and she remembered him as looking out for her and letting her, for example, sit at a table with guests, but being sure that she didn't have too much to drink and being sure that she could get home afterwards safely.
Frederick Thomas manages to escape Russia, which was in the grip of the Civil War in 1919 with almost nothing in his pockets, yet he manages to reinvent himself in Istanbul and once again succeed remarkably. And yet his end was rather tragic. Could you say a few words about what brought Frederick Thomas's final undoing?
Sure. Let me just sketch briefly the difficulties that he endured. He did, with a lot of trouble, get out of Moscow in the summer of 1918, made it to Odessa, which in those days was under German occupation. He had property there, too. But he did lose all of his money when he finally had to escape the approaching Bolsheviks in April of 1919. He remembered that he had about $25 to his name, which, even given the currency changes since those days, wasn't very much, just a few $100s. He went into terrible debt in Constantinople to open his first entertainment venue. It took him a number of years to be able to establish himself, but he did establish himself within 3 years as the owner of the premier nightclub for Constantinople and actually for that part of the world. So fame about him spread. And, for example, American tourists used to come to Constantinople in the 1920s on cruise ships, and they would be amazed that there was this elegant, rich, by then, black American running the fanciest nightclub in Constantinople. They would write about this in articles in newspapers back home or write letters to the editor. But Thomas could not escape the long reach of American racism when he was in Constantinople. He had to deal with the American diplomats at the Consulate General in Constantinople, and they refused to recognize his American origins. So that when, in 1923, the Turkish Republic was proclaimed, Thomas became stateless because his former Russian citizenship meant nothing. The Americans wouldn't give him their recognition as an American. The new Turkish government was opposed to letting foreigners have much freedom in their new republic. So he was left without the protection of the American diplomats. He also became extravagant once he made a lot of money and would throw it around. And there was competition from Turkish organized entertainment venues that siphoned clients away from him. And so his debts returned. They got worse. His property was seized. He tried to escape from Constantinople by going to Angora, or Ankara as the capital is now called. He was imprisoned. He fell ill, and he died, sick and penniless, in Constantinople in 1928.
When reading The Black Russian, I was struck by how cinematic the book felt.
There is something cinematic about Thomas's life. The sweep of it as he moves from one exotic locale to another, the kind of events that took place in the background, the Russian Revolution unfolding in Moscow when Thomas was there. I thought that somebody like Denzel Washington would make a terrific actor, and it should be shot on location in Moscow.
Vladimir Alexandrov, thank you very much for taking the time for being with us on the Russian Book World.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
And our thanks to Voice of Russia's New York correspondent Vasili Sushko for that interview.